Introduction of Vegetarianism and Occultism by C.W. Leadbeater. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Vegetarianism and Occultism by C.W. Leadbeater. Introduction. In speaking the relation between vegetarianism and occultism, it may be well for us to begin by defining our terms. We all know what is meant by vegetarianism, and although there are several varieties of it, it will not be necessary to discuss them. The vegetarian is one who abstains from eating flesh food. There are some of them who admit such animal products as are obtained without destroying the life of the animal, as for example, milk, butter, and cheese. There are others who restrict themselves to certain varieties of the vegetable, to fruit and nuts perhaps. There are others who prefer to take only such food as can be eaten uncooked. Others will take no food which grows underground, such as potatoes, turnips, carrots, etc. We need not concern ourselves with these divisions, but simply define the vegetarian as one who abstains from any food which is obtained by the slaughter of animals, of course including birds and fish. How shall we define occultism? The word is derived from the Latin occultus, hidden, so that it is the study of the hidden laws of nature. Since all the great laws of nature are in fact working in the invisible world far more than the visible, occultism involves the acceptance of a much wider view of nature than that which is ordinarily taken. The occultist, then, is a man who studies all the laws of nature that he can reach or of which he can hear, and as a result of his study he identifies himself with these laws and devotes his life to the service of evolution. How does occultism regard vegetarianism? It regards it very favorably, and that for many reasons. These reasons may be divided into two classes: those which are ordinary and physical, and those which are occult or hidden. There are many reasons in favor of vegetarianism, which are down here on the physical plane and patent to the eye of anyone who will take the trouble to examine the subject, and these will operate with the occult student even more strongly than with the ordinary man. In addition to these, and altogether beyond them, the occult student knows of other reasons which come from the study of those hidden laws which are as yet so little understood by the majority of mankind. We must therefore divide our consideration of these reasons into two parts, first taking the ordinary and physical. Even these ordinary reasons may themselves be subdivided into two classes, the first containing those which are physical and, as it were, selfish, and secondly those which may be described as the moral and unselfish considerations. First, then, let us take the reasons in favor of vegetarianism which concern only the man himself and are purely upon the physical plane. For the moment we will put aside the consideration of the effect upon others, which is so infinitely more important, and think only of the results for the man himself. It is necessary to do this because one of the objections frequently brought against vegetarianism is that it is a beautiful theory, but one the working out of which is impractical, since it is supposed that a man cannot live without devouring dead flesh. That objection is irrational, and is founded upon ignorance or perversion of facts. I am myself an example of its falsity, for I have lived without the pollution of flesh food, without meat, fish, or fowl, for the last 38 years, and I not only still survive, but I have been during all that time in remarkably good health. Nor am I in any way peculiar in this, for I know some thousands of others who have done the same thing. I know some younger ones who have been so happy as to be unpolluted by the eating of flesh during their whole lives, and are distinctly freer from disease than those who partake of such things. Assuredly, there are many reasons in favor of vegetarianism from the purely selfish point of view, and I will put that first, because I know that the selfish considerations will appeal most strongly to the majority of people, though I hope that in the case of those who are studying theosophy, we may assume that the moral considerations, which I shall later adduce, will sway them far more forcibly. End of introduction. Recording by Andrea Fiore. Occult Reasons. Under this heading also we shall have two sets of reasons, those which refer to ourselves and our own development, and those which refer to the great scheme of evolution and our duty towards it, so that once more we may classify them as selfish and unselfish, although at a much higher level than before. I have, I hope, clearly shown in the earlier part of this lecture that there is simply no room for discussion in regard to this question of vegetarianism. The whole of the evidence and of the considerations are entirely on one side, and there is absolutely nothing to be said in opposition to them. This is even more strikingly the case when we come to consider the occult part of our agreement. There are some students hovering around the fringes of occultism who are not yet prepared to follow its dictates to the uttermost, and therefore do not accept its teaching when it interferes with their personal habits and desires. Some such have tried to maintain that the question of food can make little difference from the occult standpoint, but the unanimous verdict of all of the great schools of occultism, both ancient and modern, has been definite on this point, and has asserted that for all true progress purity is necessary, even on the physical plane, and in matters of diet, as well as in far higher matters. In many books and lectures I have already explained the existence of the different planes of nature and of the vast unseen world all about us, and I have also had occasion to refer often to the fact that man has within himself matter belonging to all these higher planes, so that he is furnished with a vehicle corresponding to each of them, through which he can receive impressions, and by means of which he can act. Can these higher bodies of man be in any way affected by the food which enters into the physical body with which they are so closely connected? Assuredly they can, and for this reason. The physical matter in man is in close touch with the astral and mental matter, so much so that each is to a great extent a counterpart of the other. There are many types and degrees of density among astral matter, for example, so that it is possible for one man to have an astral body built of coarse and gross particles, while another may have one which is much more delicate and refined. As the astral body is the vehicle of the emotions, passions, and sensations, it follows that the man whose astral body is of the grosser type will be chiefly amenable to the grosser varieties of passion and emotion, whereas the man who has a finer astral body will find that its particles most readily vibrate in response to higher and more refined emotions and aspirations. The man, therefore, who builds gross and undesirable matter into his physical body is thereby drawing into his astral body matter of a coarse and unpleasant type as its counterpart. We all know that on the physical plane the effect of overindulgence in dead flesh is to produce a coarse, gross appearance in the man. That does not mean that it is only the physical body which is in an unlovely condition. It means also that those parts of the man which are invisible to our ordinary sight, the astral and the mental bodies, are not in good condition either. Thus a man who is building himself a gross and impure physical body is building for himself at the same time coarse and unclean astral and mental bodies as well. That is visible at once to the eye of the developed clairvoyant. The man who learns to see these higher vehicles sees at once the effects on the higher bodies produced by impurity in the lower. He sees at once the difference between the man who feeds his physical vehicle with pure food and the man who puts into it this loathsome, decaying flesh. Let us see how this difference will affect the man's evolution. Ghastly, unseen results. The feelings of nervousness and profound depression, which are so common, are largely due to that awful influence which spreads over the city like a plague cloud. I do not know how many thousands of creatures are killed every day, but the number is very large. Remember that every one of these creatures is a definite entity, not a permanent, reincarnating individuality like yours or mine, but still an entity which has its life upon the astral plane and persists there for a considerable time. Remember that every one of these remains to pour out his feelings of indignation and horror at all the injustice and torment which has been inflicted upon him. Realize for yourself the terrible atmosphere which exists about those slaughterhouses. Remember that a clairvoyant can see the vast hosts of animal souls, that he knows how strong are their feelings of horror and resentment, and how these recoil at all points upon the human race. They react most of all upon those who are least able to resist them, upon the children, who are more delicate and sensitive than the hardened adult. That city is a terrible place in which to bring up children, a place where the whole atmosphere, both physical and psychic, is charged with fumes of blood, and with all that that means. I read an article only the other day in which it was explained that the nauseating stench which rises from those Chicago slaughterhouses and settles like a fatal miasma over the city is by no means the most deadly influence that comes up from that Christian hell for animals, though it is the breath of certain death to many a mother's darling. The slaughterhouses make not only a pest hole for the bodies of children, but for their souls as well. Not only are the children employed in the most revolting and cruel work, but the whole trend of their thoughts is directed towards killing. Occasionally, one is found too sensitive to endure the sights and sounds of that ceaseless, awful battle between man's cruel lust and the inalienable right of every creature to its own life. I read how one boy, for whom a minister had secured a place in the slaughterhouse, returned day after day, pale and sick and unable to eat or sleep, and finally came to that minister of the gospel of the compassionate Christ, and told him that he was willing to starve if necessary, but that he could not wait in blood another day. The horrors of the slaughter had so affected him that he could no longer sleep. Yet this is what many a boy is doing and seeing from day to day, until he becomes hardened to the taking of life, and then some day, instead of cutting the throat of a lamb or a pig, he kills a man, and straightway we turn our lust for slaughter upon him in turn, and think that we have done justice. I read that a young woman who does much philanthropic work in the neighborhood of these pest houses declares that what most impresses her about the children is that they seem to have no games except games of killing, that they have no conception of any relation to animals except the relation of the slaughterer to the victim. This is the education which so-called Christians are giving to the children of the slaughterhouse, a daily education in murder, and then they express surprise at the number and brutality of the murders in that district. Yet your Christian public goes on serenely saying its prayers and singing its psalms and listening to its sermons, as if no such outrages were being perpetrated against God's children in that sinkhole of pestilence and crime. Surely the habit of eating dead flesh has produced a moral apathy among us. Are you doing well, do you think, in rearing your future citizens among surroundings of such utter brutality as this? Even on the physical plane, this is a terribly serious matter, and from the occult point of view, it is unfortunately far more serious still, for the occultist sees the psychic result of all this, sees how these forces are acting upon the people, and how they intensify brutality and unscrupulousness. He sees what a center of vice and of crime you have created, and how from it the infection is gradually spreading until it affects the whole country and even the whole world of what is called civilized humanity. The world is being affected by it in many ways, which most people do not in the least realize. There are constant feelings of causeless terror in the air. Many of your children are unnecessarily and inexplicably afraid. They feel terror of they know not what, terror of the dark, or when they are alone for a few moments. Strong forces are playing about us for which you cannot account, and you do not realize that this all comes from the fact that the whole atmosphere is charged with the hostility of these murdered creatures. The stages of evolution are closely interrelated, and you cannot do wholesale murder in this way upon your younger brothers without feeling the effect terribly among your own innocent children. Surely a better time shall come when we shall be free from this horrible blot upon our civilization, this awful reproach upon our compassion and our sympathy, and when that comes, we shall find presently that there will be a vast improvement in these matters, and by degrees we shall all rise to a higher level and be freed from all these instinctive terrors and hatreds. Man's duty towards nature. Then there is the far more important unselfish side of the question, that of man's duty towards nature. Every religion has taught that man should put himself always on the side of the will of God in the world, on the side of good as against evil, of evolution as against retrogression. The man who ranges himself on the side of evolution realizes the wickedness of destroying life. He knows that, just as he is here in this physical body in order that he may learn the lessons of this plane, so is the animal occupying his body for the same reason, and that through it he may gain experience at his lower stage. He knows that the life behind the animal is the divine life, that all life in the world is divine, that animals therefore are truly our brothers, even though they may be younger brothers, and we have no sort of right to take their lives for the gratification of our perverted tastes, no right to cause them untold agony and suffering merely to satisfy our degraded and detestable lusts. We have brought things to such a pass with our miscalled sport and our wholesale slaughterings that all wild creatures fly from the sight of us. Does that seem like the universal brotherhood of God's creatures? Is that your idea of the golden age of the worldwide kindliness that is to come? A condition when every living thing flees from the face of man because of his murderous instincts? There is an influence flowing back upon us from all this, an effect which you can hardly realize unless you are able to see how it looks when regarded with the sight of the higher plane. Every one of these creatures, which you so ruthlessly murder in this way, has its own thoughts and feelings with regard to all this. It has horror, pain, and indignation, and an intense but unexpressed feeling of the hideous injustice of it all. The whole atmosphere about us is full of it. Twice lately I have heard from psychic people that they felt the awful aura or surroundings of Chicago, even many miles away from it. Mrs. Besant herself told me the same thing years ago in England, that long before she came in sight of Chicago she felt the horror of it, and the deadly pall of depression descending upon her, and asked, "Where are we? And what is the reason that there should be this terrible feeling in the air? To sense the effect as clearly as this is beyond the reach of the person who is not developed, but though all the inhabitants may not be directly conscious of it and recognize it, as Mrs. Besant did, they may be sure that they are suffering from it unconsciously, and that that terrible vibration of horror and fear and injustice is acting upon every one of them, even though they do not know it. Because the eating of dead bodies leads to indulgence in drink and increases animal passions in man, Mr. H.P. Fowler, who has studied and lectured on dipsomania for 40 years, declares that the use of flesh foods, by the excitation that it exercises on the nervous system, prepares the way for habits of intemperance in everything, and the more flesh is consumed, the more serious is the danger of confirmed alcoholism. Many experienced physicians have made similar experiments, and wisely act on them in their treatment of dipsomaniacs. The lower part of man's nature is undoubtedly intensified by the habit of feeding upon corpses. Even after eating a full meal of such horrible material, a man still feels unsatisfied, for he is still conscious of a vague uncomfortable sense of want, and consequently he suffers greatly from nervous strain. This craving is the hunger of the bodily tissues, which cannot be renewed by the poor stuff offered to them as food. To satisfy this vague craving, or rather to appease these restless nerves so that it will no longer be felt, recourse is often had to stimulants. Sometimes alcoholic beverages are taken, sometimes an attempt is made to allay these feelings with black coffee, and at other times strong tobacco is used in the endeavor to soothe the irritated, exhausted nerves. Here we have the beginning of intemperance, for in the majority of cases intemperance began in the attempt to allay, with alcoholic stimulants, the vague uncomfortable sense of want which follows the eating of impoverished food, food that does not feed. There is no doubt that drunkenness, and all the poverty, wretchedness, disease and crime associated with it, may frequently be traced to errors of feeding. We might follow out this line of thought indefinitely. We might speak of the irritability, occasionally culminating in insanity, which is now acknowledged by all authorities to be a frequent result of erroneous feeding. We might mention 100 familiar symptoms of indigestion, and explain that indigestion is always the result of incorrect feeding. Surely, however, enough has been said to indicate the importance and far-reaching influence of a pure diet upon the welfare of the individual and of the race. Mr. Bramwell Booth, the chief of the Salvation Army, has issued a pronunciamento upon the subject of vegetarianism, in which he speaks strongly and decidedly in its favor, giving a list of no less than 19 good reasons why men should abstain from the eating of flesh. He insists that a vegetarian diet is necessary to purity, to chastity, and to the perfect control of the appetites and passions, which are so often the source of great temptation. He remarks that the growth of meat-eating among the people is one of the causes of the increase of drunkenness, and that it also favors indolence, sleepiness, want of energy, indigestion, constipation, and other like miseries and degradations. He also states that eczema, piles, worms, dysentery, and severe headaches are frequently brought on by flesh diet, and that he believes the great increase in consumption and cancer during the last 100 years to have been caused by the corresponding increase in the use of animal food. Because the vegetable diet is in every way cheaper as well as better than flesh. In the encyclical just mentioned, Mr. Booth gives us one of his reasons for advocating it, that a vegetarian diet of wheat, oats, maize and other grains, lentils, peas, beans, nuts, and similar food is more than 10 times as economical as a flesh diet. Meat contains half its weight in water, which has to be paid for as though it were meat. A vegetable diet, even if we allow cheese, butter, and milk, will cost only about a quarter as much as a mixed diet of flesh and vegetables. Tens of thousands of our poor people, who have now the greatest difficulty to make ends meet after buying flesh food, would by the substitution of fruit and vegetables and other economical foods be able to get along in comfort. There is also an economic side of this question which must not be ignored. Note how many more men could be supported by a certain number of acres of land which were devoted to the growing of wheat, than by the same amount of land which was laid out in pasture. Think, too, for how many more men healthily work upon the land would be found in the former case than in the latter, and I think you will begin to see that there is a great deal to be said from this point of view also.
Please subscribe the channel if you want to see other videos, push the bell button to get the notification for the new videos, and like it if you learned anything new.